My name is Joe Stieb. We're going to go ahead and transition directly into our next panel. We have three guests with us today. I'm just going to take 1 minute to make sure that they are all set. Great. Okay, so we are just transitioning directly into our next event. Welcome to anyone who's hopping on right now. Welcome to the Mershon Center for National Security Studies here at Ohio State. We're very glad that you could join us today. My name is Joe Stieb. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at Mershon. I'll be the moderator of our discussion today. In this panel, we have three distinguished scholars who will discuss the strategic, political, and cultural impacts of the 9/11 attacks at our 20-year anniversary, which is tomorrow. After our speakers have finished, we will go to the audience for questions. If you have a question, I'd like you to put it in the Q&A function down at the bottom right-hand panel of your screen, and I will relay the questions to our panelists. I'm just going to introduce the speakers, and then we'll jump into the discussion. Our first speaker is Professor Jacqueline Hazelton of the U.S. Naval War College. Professor Hazelton is an expert on grand strategy, counterinsurgency, terrorism, and U.S. foreign policy. She recently published a book with Cornell University Press entitled Bullets Not Ballots, Success in Counterinsurgency Warfare. Our second speaker is Spencer Ackerman. Mr. Ackerman is a journalist who has reported extensively on issues relating to the war on terror for publications such as Wired, The Guardian, and The Daily Beast. He recently published a book with Penguin entitled The Reign of Terror, How 9/11 Destabilized America and Produced Trump. And then our third speaker is Professor Elisabeth Anker of George Washington University, both the departments of Political Science and American Studies. She studies political theory, contemporary US politics, and gender and sexuality, amongst a variety of other topics. In 2014, she published Orgies of Feeling, Melodrama and the Politics of Freedom with Duke University Press. And next year, she has a book coming out entitled Ugly Freedoms. We're going to start today with Professor Hazelton, who will discuss the foreign policy and strategic impacts of September 11th. And I just have to make sure that she is unmuted.
Of course I am.
Great.
A year and a half later, I'm still figuring out how to unmute myself. All right, here we go. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'm going to talk about change and continuity in US foreign and military policy in the past 20 years since the 9/11 attacks. The continuities are largely viewpoints that are not helpful for US interests, and the single change I identify, unfortunately, is not helpful either. I see four eras for us to look at. There's the Cold War period, 1945 to 1989, the relatively brief post-Cold War period, often called the unitary moment, from 1989 to 2001, the global war on terror from 9/11-01 to the 2017 national security strategy that announced the return of great power competition. And then we have the present time, the return of great power competition from 2017 to the present. First, the continuities. I'll give some examples after listing them, and then I'll talk very briefly about the major difference that I find across this long span of time since the end of World War II. I'll close with a quick look at how the war in Afghanistan exemplifies these costly habits of mind. The first continuities that I identify, the first one is binary or bipolar thinking, in which the United States sees itself facing an existential enemy that wants to take over the world. The second continuity is a belief on the part of policymakers and military leaders that US military power can achieve political change anywhere and everywhere. The third continuity is the belief that Western liberal values are universal, and correspondingly that the United States can go abroad to spread them and must do so to assure its own security globally. The fourth continuity is the belief that any change of course by the United States will lead its partners and allies to doubt its credibility and thus abandon it, and the related domino theory, that if the United States loses a partner anywhere, further partners will fall like lined up dominoes, leaving the United States standing alone. And then finally, the fifth continuity is difficulty recognizing that not all adversaries are necessarily monolithic. And this includes the problem of threat assessment. In terms of examples, we can see binary or bipolar thinking in all four periods since the end of World War II. And it matters because this black and white thinking encourages a lack of discrimination in prioritizing or ranking threats and opportunities. It leads to a lack of understanding of the adversary. It ignores the power of nationalism within other countries, and it leads to costly wars with unattainable political goals. In the Cold War, for example, we are familiar with the US versus the communist thinking, the free world versus the communist world, the red hand of communism behind every political change thought to be dangerous to the United States, and most everything around the world was seen as dangerous. In that unitary moment, we see the United States and the West pairing to battle internal conflict and humanitarian suffering. The belief there, this black and white mentality, was that these things can be stopped. They can be ended, not just managed. Once again, this is an unachievable political objective. During the GWAT, we see the United States versus jihadis and rogue states. Once again, as President George W. Bush said, you're either with us or against us. And policymakers saw the black flag of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda Central behind every problem in Muslim majority states or in Muslim communities elsewhere. Today, we see this binary thinking with the United States and maybe others facing the vast threat of China. The second continuity is the belief in US military power to achieve change globally. This is a problem because it leads to unnecessary, unwinnable wars and lost opportunities. During the Cold War, we had a series of proxy wars from Nicaragua to Angola to Vietnam, states that posed little threat to US interests and underwent great suffering at the hands of the great powers involved in their domestic conflicts. During the unitary moment, we saw the use of militaries to solve political problems, such as sending NATO into Bosnia and Kosovo to demonstrate that the alliance was still useful after the end of the Cold War. There's also this element of trying to rescue non-Americans. We can think of Kipling's White Man's Burden, or the French mission Civilisatrice. And we see this again in the GWAT, along with the proxy wars. Georgia, the Philippines, Yemen, Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Mali, Nigeria, Niger. These are interventions that weaken the United States and threaten its interests in their ability to increase anti-Americanism. Today, we see this focus on Chinese and US military power and military threats rather than on the non-military interactions and elements of cooperation that are part of every great power relationship. Relatedly, there's this belief that Western liberal values are universal. The United States can spread them abroad and that it must do so. This matters because, once again, it brings the United States into unnecessary wars with high human costs and lost opportunities. During the Cold War, we saw those proxy wars, military interventions to change the domestic politics of other states. In the unitary moment, we saw military interventions once again intended to change the domestic politics of other states and rescue those unfortunate enough to not be Americans. During the GWAT, we see once again these interventions to change domestic politics within other states, which, by the way, we should see by now, based even only on the Afghanistan example, is impossible. And today we see this attitude about liberal values leading American policymakers and practitioners to argue against other states cooperating with China on the basis of values rather than the more compelling argument of interest. The fourth habit of mind or worldview that continues over the these four periods is a belief that any US change of course threatens a US credibility and thus US partnerships. Why do we care? Here we care because once again, this leads to the extension of wars, some unnecessary, if not all. We see less than successful military interventions based on this belief. We see military interventions that didn't happen and thus are used to argue for more military interventions in the future. During the Cold War, we saw arguments, for example, that the United States should stay in Vietnam. In the unitary moment, we saw arguments for the United States to stay in the Balkans, to send its military into Somalia, into Rwanda, into Darfur, Sudan, into every hotspot with or without evidence that US interests were at stake and with or without prospects for success. Once again, this is this rescue mission mentality. In the GWAT, we see the credibility argument used to urge the United States to stay in Afghanistan, to stay in Iraq, to stay in these smaller and less prominent theaters like Nigeria, like Yemen, like Somalia. And in the present, we see the United States' predilection to show military strength against China, to even act provocatively at times to demonstrate credibility or resolve to China and to other states. Finally, there's the continuity of having a hard time recognizing that not all adversaries are necessarily monolithic. And part and parcel with this is threat inflation. This is important because it makes action, do anything, do something, seem necessary and even urgent. It prevents or slows cooperation and the gains that cooperation can provide. It causes unnecessary human losses and it alienates other actors. When it comes to threat inflation, I'm always reminded of the lines in A Midsummer Night's Dream. In the night, imagining some fear, how easy is a bush supposed to bear? During the Cold War, we saw this in the fact that it took almost 25 years for the United States to recognize that not all communist states were one single actor, that in fact, different states have different interests, even when they share an ideology. And the unitary moment, we saw the United States prescribing the same military intervention for internal crises of various types without necessarily understanding the domestic politics. In Somalia, for example, had the United States and the United Nations worked with the warlord Muhammad Farid Aidid's clan, instead of trying to break its power, there might have been greater success in distributing food to the starving, and the terrible Black Hawk Down battle might have been avoided. During the GWAT, we see attitude very similar to that of the Cold War. The United States has broadly lumped all Islamist groups together, violent and non-violent, and painted them as an existential threat to the West. It's lumped all jihadis who are violent together as an existential threat to the West. And this turns many Muslims away from the United States, and not only Muslims either, those who see the bigotry in this. In fact, the global adversary the United States faces is a set of quite unpopular terrorist organizations with little in the way of capabilities to harm US interests. And the present period, we see threat inflation as a particular problem for how the US sees China. China has major demographic, environmental, and internal security problems that are only going to get more acute. But the US sees this immediate existential threat. And once again, there's little recognition that great power interactions historically include cooperation as well as competition. Overall, I see these problems limiting US thinking about difficulties it faces and about potential outcomes. I see it preventing the prioritization of interests, threats, and opportunities. I see these attitudes creating unachievable political objectives, inadvertently damaging US interests, and leading to very high human costs in all the military interventions that we've seen. One continuity that I find particularly troubling is the belief in the universality of liberal values and the associated belief that they can be spread through the military tool. It troubles me because it leads to interventions with unattainable political objectives like Afghanistan and like Iraq, and in an earlier period like Vietnam, all of which had the goal of building a modern, centralized, democratic state. The belief that any non-democratic state somehow threatens US interests is dangerous. It's been with us since the Cold War. It leads to the hubris of trying to transform other states' domestic politics, the hubris of trying to do it primarily by military means, the death and destruction that accompany these interventions, and the wars without end that result. The fact is, the United States is tremendously strong and safe, probably the safest and the strongest state ever in the world. It is this tremendous power that creates the greatest difference across these eras. In the GWAT and under President Trump, the world saw the United States as a loose cannon, particularly under President G.W. Bush at the beginning of the GWAT. His second term was somewhat different. So President Bush and President Trump, the United States behaved as a loose cannon. In fact, as a rogue state, according to the US definition of a rogue state, it was liable to do anything, threaten anyone without hesitation and without concern for institutional constraints or norms. Seeing a country as powerful as the United States behaving unpredictably understandably scared the dickens out of the rest of the world. We'll have to see how that affects US interests going forward. Finally, Afghanistan. I see prominently in this war the problems of threat inflation, the inability to accurately identify and assess the adversary, and thus the bipolar thinking about the Taliban, who are not jihadis and aren't entirely focused on Afghanistan, the belief that the United States had to stay the course no matter what to protect its reputation, and the unsupported belief that liberal values are universal and easily spread by the military. We can see how well it all turned out, badly for the United States, far worse for Afghanistan and Afghans. Thank you. I look forward to the discussion and the other presentations.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hazelton. We really appreciate those comments. Okay, so now we're going to transition over to Spencer Ackerman. He will discuss the political legacies and impacts of 9/11, looking back after 20 years.
Well, thanks very much, Joe. Thank you very much to the Ohio State University. And a quick just note of recognition, I've learned a lot. I've benefited a lot from Professor Hazelton's work over the years. So I just wanted to acknowledge that before moving forward, especially because I disagree with some of her points. To speak about the war on terror and its political legacies, I want to start with something that the war on terror has throughout its existence deliberately obscured from the public, which is, as the Costs of War Project at Brown University has now published, the war on terror in a very analytically conservative estimate, which is to say the United States killed 900,000 people, very likely more. The war on terror created, which is to say the United States created and is responsible for, tens of millions of refugees that the United States and its allies in Europe will treat and are continuing to treat, in the case of Afghanistan, as no different from the extremist organizations or regimes that prompted those people to flee, or the chaos unleashed by the United States in doing that. We understand very little, ultimately, of the human impact of the United States on the war on terror, because we don't want to see it, because it disrupts our sense of American exceptionalism, and it disrupts the jingoism that has held sway over the United States across the ideological spectrum that says, that is justified by, through waving the bloody flag of 9/11, that the United States is the actor of history, not the one to be acted upon. This is an ideology called American exceptionalism. It sits within the firmware of American political consciousness long before we start sorting out what our individual politics are. American exceptionalism is not truly a statement in the final analysis about the virtue of America and the ideas of America that make it a light unto nations. It's instead infused with that sensibility, infused with that righteousness, a doctrine that says the United States uniquely has not only the right, but the obligation to police the globe and sort out global politics for the rest of the globe, while simultaneously not being bound by the rules that it expects everyone else to apply. That in macro was the foundational sense of the war on terror, particularly in its early days. When Professor Hazelton talks about America appearing like a loose cannon, to the rest of the world, this was another continuity, not a departure on 9/11, particularly in so many countries around the world that have legacies, certainly from the Cold War, but even earlier. Certainly think of a case of the Philippines, think of the Caribbean, think of Latin and Central America. They have legacies of the United States destabilizing them. That was not something the United States was willing remotely to consider. It was not willing to consider purposefully the location of 9/11 inside that history, inside that legacy of American destabilization or elite and frankly private interest, disguising itself using the language of the national interest or US security. As with the Cold War, what in fact is being protected is not Americans' physical security, but the security of American dominance. That certainly extends throughout the Cold War, and that is certainly at work, as Professor Hazelton has sort of pointed to in her previous presentation, with what the actual anxieties are when it comes to China. It's not about human rights in China. It's not about whether a democratic model will prevail. It's about whether the United States or another party will set the terms for the rest of the world. All of this impulse, particularly ones channeled for the purposes of violence, is what emerges in strength on 9/11, not uniquely throughout American history, but I argue in my book, Reign of Terror, how the 9/11 era destabilized America and produced Trump, that what is so distinguishing about this period in American history is how American it is, how deeply rooted in American history it is. 9/11 is a doorway to the most nativist, the most racist, and the most violent elements of American history that gives it license under the cover of patriotic emergency, not only to do violence overseas, but to do violence at home and to define that violence against an enemy that is spoken of increasingly in civilizational terms, not against an organization called Al-Qaeda that materially murdered 3,000 Americans, but against broad masses of not just Muslims overseas, but American Muslims. And I want to point out through perhaps the most important example that I can think of, what the war on terror has always been inside the United States from the jump. And I'm going to do that by explaining that I'm a native New Yorker. I live in central Brooklyn. I live in a wonderful part of the world called Flatbush. I'm lucky enough that I live in the place where I'm from. And about a mile or so west of me is a neighborhood called Little Pakistan. Little Pakistan, a working class immigrant neighborhood, became one of the epicenters of an NYPD, an FBI, and an INS crackdown that dragged people from their houses, that imprisoned them without charge, that held them under tortured, rationales legally, manipulating things like a statute known as the material witness statute that's supposed to be about stopping witnesses to a crime from fleeing, and use that to say that all manner of people from Muslim and immigrant backgrounds after 9/11 were guilty until proven innocent. They would slip cards under my neighbor's apartment doors. This is the FBI, this is the INS, this is the NYPD. Call me, we have to talk. I need to talk to you right now. I'm going to read from some statements that community leaders compiled in the months after 9/11 from children of the neighborhood of Little Pakistan. This is what they say. This is a 15-year-old girl. When the attacks of September 11th came, I was called the Taliban because my last name sounds like Taliban. A 12-year-old girl. They called my people and me terrorists. I get cursed at and I start to lose my temper. An 11-year-old boy. They called me Paki bitch. They called my dad Osama. A 15-year-old girl. In school, guys pull down my scarf. That girl said that she didn't, like everyone else I have just read from, she didn't report any of this activity to any authorities because she thought that would get her in more trouble or those authorities wouldn't listen. And that was a very rational response to a time like this. We talk so much and are going to be hearing so many remembrances in mainstream media over these next several days and have already about the spirit of unity that took hold after 9/11. And what all of that narrative obscures, like a drunk waking up from a bender, is that such supposed unity was weaponized and it was aimed at other Americans in patterns that generations of American immigrants have faced, in patterns that American native populations have faced, in patterns that the descendants of people brought here as chattel slaves to be property to generate the wealth of this country that they and their descendants would never enjoy. Very familiar American histories. This application of American history was not limited to the George W. Bush administration. This became a semi-permanent and deeply embedded and frequently justified aspect of American politics, to the point where, to take some examples over the course of the War on Terror, how a community center in Lower Manhattan, where American Muslims have lived for generations, became the ground zero mosque, a statement of civilizational threat. It was described as it was described by ignorant people on the right who made a lot of money selling their conspiracy theories throughout the War on Terror as a victory mosque, a celebration of 9/11, not what the people who created it intended it to be explicitly, which was a refutation of 9/11. That is how Republican-controlled legislatures around the country start passing so-called creeping Sharia bills to stop so-called Sharia law. Ultimately, we would see that intention mature in Charlottesville when white supremacists started chanting about how they would not be replaced. That was the language of the Sharia law panic. You can go back and read it from the time. It talks about how Americans must not allow Muslims to replace the Constitution and our way of life, as if it is not also our neighbor's way of life, whatever our neighbors believe, with Sharia law. That was a deliberately cultivated hysteria. And to give perhaps the most possibly familiar example, but one that I don't think is very well understood, consider birtherism, the lie that Barack Obama, the first Black president, was not a legitimate president because he was, as the conspiracy theory deceitfully said, secretly a foreign, specifically Kenya-born Muslim. Now, the anti-Black racism of birtherism is so loud and so all-consuming that it can be easy to overlook what else is at work through birtherism. What else is at work through birtherism is the war on terror and the logic of the war on terror. Because what makes Barack Obama a threat is not just his racial background, it's the fact that he's a foreign Muslim. He is the sort of people that the war on terror had been claiming were ready at any moment to kill you and everyone else you cared about. The purpose of this lie was exactly what those politics imply, that Barack Obama, he's not your political adversary. Barack Obama is your enemy. Barack Obama is president in order to ensure the triumph of the people who attacked us on 9/11. And powerful people, ultimately to include Donald Trump, the president of the United States, exploit these sorts of lies, as they had all throughout the war on terror, to remain in power. So I want to leave just by saying that the war on terror, in both respectable and not respectable responses throughout the war, is not something that only happens overseas. It's something that happens all throughout the United States. It's something that happens all throughout here at home, inside the United States. It's something that destroys constitutional boundaries. It's something that through the transformation of the structures of hard power that in particular apply domestically, bulk surveillance on a scale that simply cannot be reconciled with the Fourth Amendment, expansive prosecutorial and law enforcement opportunities to criminalize association far away from any act of violence, the financial tools to ruin people's lives, the placement of informants in people's houses of worship, and only some people's, because the war on terror throughout always exempts white people, despite the fact that, much as in Pakistan, America hosts tremendously durable, often very visible, often very present terrorist organizations, violent organizations, white supremacist organizations that mean to do violence. This is, by function of the war on terror, seen as something that isn't precisely what it is. Violent and often righteously, if not religiously justified behavior to intimidate domestic political opponents and ensure the retention and expansion of power. That's terrorism in Peshawar as it is in northeastern Oklahoma. The war on terror makes sure not to see that by design. This is what the war on terror is. It is also not over, with apologies to Professor Hazelton, just because H.R. McMaster and Jim Mattis decide to write a strategy that says, nope, now we're about great power competition, which is just another term for imperial struggle. The reason why I say that is because they might have meant to kind of pivot security elites over to the challenge they want, but they don't end the war. The operations do not cease, the authorities do not cease, and so accordingly the politics don't cease. And we are seeing them exactly recapitulate themselves and play out, whether it's over COVID, with the conspiracy theory that this was a deliberate attack by China in a lab. What does that license? It licenses exactly what we've seen: acts of vigilante violence against our Asian American neighbors, just as it licensed acts of vigilante violence and state repression against our Muslim neighbors. That's the war on terror. That's why it must not be seen as anything less than a reign of terror, a full-blown and ongoing democratic emergency. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Spencer. We're now going to shift over to Elisabeth Anker. She's going to discuss the cultural impacts and legacies of the last 20 years. Elisabeth, you can go right ahead.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me? Great, thanks. I also have some slides, so I'll turn them on in a second. I also want to thank Ohio State for having me here today and for being in conversation. So in my talk today, I will argue that US politics in the post 9/11 period is influenced by what I call melodramatic political discourse, right? We typically think of melodrama as a storyline from movies and books that often involves the hysterical emotions of victimized and injured people. Yet melodrama is more complex. They often tell stories about people who are besieged by overwhelming nefarious forces, and they draw on heightened emotions. They draw on moral binaries of good and evil. They characterize people either as villains, victims, or heroes. And they often tell stories with plots that end with the triumph of the hero. While humanities scholars have often looked at how melodrama suffuses films and movies and is the most popular form of American mass culture, I want to call attention to melodrama's presence in politics, in our political speeches, and in the way that we narrate confusing and ambiguous events. Melodramas often shape political oratory on both sides of the aisle, and we can find melodrama all over American politics, in televised news media and commentary, in speeches, interviews with political officials, in journalistic platforms, in academia, and in informal discussion between citizens. Right? Melodramatic narratives are often what we use to make hold of confusing and frightening political events. And what I want to argue today is that they also shape the legitimation strategies of war and of state politics and domestic politics like surveillance. Melodrama certainly does not originate with 9/11. It has a much longer and complex inheritance. It really starts to gain hold after World War II and helps to interpret the Cold War as a binary world order of villains and heroes, good and evil, freedom and oppression. Actually, what Jacqueline Hazelton earlier called the binaries and the black and white, ways of thinking, which, it is a melodramatic trope. And yet melodrama really came to the fore on 9/11 to help to make sense of these terrifying attacks and to legitimate the war on terror. They contribute to many of the problems that both of the previous speakers discussed, and their effects are still with us today. So what I'd like to do is first elaborate on kind of the 5 tropes of melodrama in politics, look at a Bush speech to see how melodrama legitimated the origins of the war on terror, and then think about their anti-democratic effects. So I am going to hope that my share screen works. And if not, I will just move forward. It looks like, unfortunately, I don't think it's working. I got a new computer literally yesterday. So I think it will not work. In which case I will perform the melodrama, just kidding, but I will describe some aspects of how it will work. So the first convention of melodrama is a moral worldview of good and evil that organizes the depictions of political events, right? So rather than political justifications for understanding politics, we get to moral justifications of good and evil. Often in politics, moral goodness describes the US nation state, and horrific evil attaches to political opposition. Number 2 is that melodramas draw on 3 character triads of villains, victims, and heroes. These descriptions are often gendered, right? We often have a kind of female or feminized, weak, performative victim and an aggressive male and strong hero. As many, feminist studies of melodrama note when we see melodrama working in film and literature, right? You can think of the women on the railroad tracks kind of scenario. What's important to note is that these characters are often highly moralized. In melodrama, being injured shows that you are a virtuous person, right? Injury proves your goodness. And so in politics, right, any attempt to injure the nation state kind of proves or justifies the moral goodness of the nation. And heroism is often found in state action, especially strong and violent forms of state action that can counter evil and redeem goodness. Number 3 is that melodrama traffics in intensified emotion. When we use melodrama colloquially, this is often what we mean, something that's histrionic, right? But melodramas often solicit heightened emotions of terror, pity, distress, and pain in spectators. And they also encourage people to identify with other people's suffering as their own. So in a film, when we get a close-up of like an injured child, right, who's crying, that's asking us to identify with their suffering. What's particularly unique to melodrama when it takes shape in politics is that it doesn't only ask us to identify with injured people, but also with heroic action. To take on that heroic violence is something that we get to feel as our own expression. One way to think about it in politics is that America is often the victim and the hero of politics, and especially the hero of global politics, right? The way in which we also heard earlier, the ways in the melodramatic narratives where America can save and rescue the world, American exceptionalism, often takes shape through America being both the victim and the hero of civilization itself. Number 4 is that melodrama describes feelings of being overpowered. So it dramatizes experiences when American victims are overwhelmed by forces outside their control, but it also promises that that feeling of being overwhelmed by evil forces is going to go away, and that pretty soon the exercise of sovereign or unilateral state power will end this experience of being overpowered and restore the American nation back to its rightful sense of its own power. Last, number 5, and unique to also politics, is that different from melodrama when it circulates in pop culture, is that melodramatic politics anticipate the triumph of freedom as the conclusion to the story. Its conventions end whenever the American hero prevails in righteous victory over its villains and regains freedom. So melodrama promises that dominating powers will be overthrown, victimization will be assuaged, and the experience of freedom will be achieved for the virtuous. Once again, when Spencer Ackerman was talking about American exceptionalism, right, this is the promise that it's American exceptionalism that will bring freedom to the world. So in sum, melodrama as a political form casts political events into a moral worldview that identifies the nation state as a virtuous and innocent victim of villainous action. It locates goodness in the nation's suffering. It locates evil in the cruelty of its antagonists who are not political but are morally evil, right? And it locates heroism in sovereign acts of national power, especially military power. It evokes intense visceral responses to injustices imposed upon America and demands heroic retribution. It morally legitimates political powers framed as necessary for salving American suffering and reestablishing freedom. So it's these conventions that have been circulating in US politics, but definitely came to the forefront on 9/11. In a moment of terror, confusion, and chaos, melodrama depicted 9/11's events through these very familiar and comforting moral and narrative forms, right? The story of 9/11 became not a story of people murdered by Al-Qaeda, or even a story of an attack on financial buildings or military centers, but the story of American people as a unified and virtuous people, bound by their innocent love of freedom, connected by shared experiences of terror and suffering from evil Muslim extremists, right? A depiction that served to demonize Islam and dramatically contribute to Islamophobia, both at home and across the globe. And within it, all Americans became morally called upon to pursue freedom by legitimating the state power to rescue the world. Right? In the following days, melodramas from across the political spectrum, right, in news media and in many other places, framed the creation of the war on terror not as a political choice, but as a moral necessity for the defeat of evil. And so let me give an example from George W. Bush's speech titled "Freedom at War with Fear." This was a speech given September 20th and is, I would argue, still the most important speech of the 21st century, in large part because it is the speech that inaugurated and legitimated the war on terror, the effects of which are still with us. It drew on the tactics of melodramatic political discourse to justify 2 key points of the war on terror. 1, the war in Afghanistan, which is already legitimated in the speech by the time of its announcement and will begin less than 3 weeks later. And 2, it inaugurates the creation of the Office of Homeland Security, which will become the Department of Homeland Security in 2002, which was the largest reorganization and consolidation of federal governance and especially security governance in 50 years. So I'm going to read the speech since I don't have the image to show you. I'm not going to read the whole speech, sorry. That's like 45 minutes. I'm going to read 2 sentences. Bush states, quote, "We have seen the decency of a loving and giving people who have made the grief of strangers their own. Today, we are awakened to danger and called to defend freedom. Our grief has turned to anger and anger to resolution. Whether we bring our enemies to justice or bring justice to our enemies, justice will be done." Okay, so what's happening here? Bush's argument goes something like this. America is a unified group of loving and grieving people who are united by their unjust injury from terrorism, right? We are a nation that is now virtuous precisely because we have been victimized on 9/11, right? Virtuous because of the way citizens identified with the suffering of others and, as Bush says, made the grief of others their own. Right? If we were watching this speech, we would note how Bush performs heightened affects as he references them. He performs grief, he cries, he performs anger, right? In a way that actually will not seem that dramatic to us after the performances of Donald Trump, but also inaugurate this very performative sense of dramatic affect in political speech making, right? Actually, Obama, when he was called No Drama Obama, was in part, a reprieve from aspects of this, even though he also used a lot of melodrama in his own descriptions of foreign policy. That's a separate issue. But here we see in Bush's speech that demonstrating grief proves America's virtue. This speech defines national identity through decency and virtue of the American people and identifies antagonists not as political opposition, but as moral evil. Right? With political opposition, you have a lot of strategies that involve forms of soft power negotiation. But when you have evil, the only thing that you can do with evil, you don't negotiate with evil, as Cheney literally said, right? And also is echoed in a line from the Terminator 4 years earlier. But what you do is you eradicate evil, right? So here we have, according to the logic of melodrama, when your enemy is an evil and you are good, you must take retributive action, and that action is always morally justified. So even as these changes are being announced for the first time, the war in Afghanistan and the Office of Homeland Security are presented as already settled, as already legitimated. This speech claims that these actions are morally mandated to protect civilization, as Bush will say later, to bring freedom, the heroic weight of freedom that is now on all Americans. So the speech uses melodramatic conventions like a moral economy of good and evil, heightened affects, the cultivation of emotions, and the promise of heroism to make the war on terror a moral imperative for the pursuit of freedom. It was actually a very different speech than we see something like FDR's speech after Pearl Harbor. So I am happy to talk about those kinds of differences later in question and answer. What has changed in 50 years? Because it's certainly not about the individual people, but about what makes them so compelling and galvanizing to the majority of Americans who vote for them. So Bush's speech legitimates war and surveillance as expressions of moral necessity, not political choices. And it turns political debates into decisions made by an administration that everybody who is a good and virtuous person would have already had to agree with. So I want to end by noting 2 things. First, that if politics is a space of collective governance, and thus of contestation, of debate and dissent about the use and distribution of power, of competing claims for what can and should be done in public life, of laws that decide what should and should not be allowed within a polity, then melodramatic stories and modes of legitimacy often place the evaluation of state power outside of this space. Melodramas moralize state action by figuring them as uncontestable, as necessary, as categorically righteous for the heroic eradication of villainy. It also silences competing options by demonizing, claiming that they are not just wrong, but immoral, or even on the side of the terrorists, right? As we all remember Bush saying, you're either with us or you are with the terrorists. And this certainly went for dissent within the nation, as well as dissent outside of it. So citizenship through melodrama is not about participation. It's not about contestation or dissent. It is about belonging to a nation of virtuous victims who feel that the legitimation of state action that is decided by the executive branch alone is an expression of their own collective goodness. And the second thing I want to note is, of course, melodrama as a narrative never came to fruition, and its promises failed, right? Mission accomplished did not accomplish the triumph of either virtue or freedom, and inaugurated wars, right? That, I mean, were inaugurated even before, but certainly the forever wars were almost inaugurated at Mission Accomplished, where we saw the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, as was already noted, the destruction of two countries and destabilization across the Middle East, right? The destruction of cultural heritages over millennia, the poisoning of landscapes, the destruction of agriculture, and failed attempts at state building. The capture of Osama bin Laden, which might have been the culmination of melodrama according to those early moments where Osama bin Laden was the personification of evil, right? His capture and murder left the country even more confused about the goals of foreign policy and the role of surveillance within. And we can note just in the past few weeks, with a horrible end to a horrible war, right, that it was not, neither was the war in Afghanistan ever able to accomplish freedom or be the, the pinnacle of virtue, but instead left in its wake violence, destruction, and mass death. Perhaps now, with all of the culminating failures of melodrama, citizens and the whole country can repoliticize the decisions and goals of state power, especially where and how to go to war. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth. Thank you for all of these very interesting commentaries. So for the audience right now, if you have questions, please go ahead and enter them into the Q&A. I'm going to exercise my moderator privileges here and ask a couple of questions based on these very interesting talks. Elisabeth, I'll start with you if you don't mind. So I think this connection of melodrama to the war on terror in 9/11 is very interesting. I think that one of the difficulties here is that the 9/11 attacks, the imagery, the experiences that we hear about from the people who were there, certainly lend themselves to a melodramatic framing, right? It's hard to think of something that is more evil than a human being weaponizing himself to kill as many innocent people as he can. We saw that 4 times in 4 separate incidents on September 11. I'm curious as to how you think that we can represent and especially how you think we can teach, especially the students now who are not even alive on September 11th, how we can represent and teach about 9/11 and the broader war on terror without falling into these tropes of melodrama. And if you have any specific kind of cultural texts, whether they're books or films, or you think actually do this in a responsible, non-melodramatic way, I'd be curious to hear about that as well.
Great. These events were intended to be spectacular, right? They were intended to be televised. They were intended to be watched by the world, right? That's something that we know. And so part of it is not just the spectacle, which is a key aspect of melodrama, right? Melodramas are always about the spectacle and the drama. Even in early melodramas in the American stage, fire was such a big part of those that these wooden theaters would burn down every single week in like the 1850s with these melodramatic explosions. So this melodrama, 9/11 certainly tapped into that. But of course, there's a difference of noting the horror and the spectacle than basing a foreign policy based on people being evil, rather than trying to understand the political decisions that led up to an event, for instance. And part of it is with 20 years, when I teach about 9/11 to my students, they're horrified to see the forms of dissent that came out, the fact that people couldn't really criticize things in public. And it was only until 2003, until 2004, that even criticisms of foreign policy were really considered as legitimate and not so insane that they were considered terrorists themselves. So some aspects change. But I also do think in our own popular culture, there are things that have led to a more critical take, not only different films that are critical of war, or films that try to, I actually think Errol Morris's documentary, for instance, Standard Operating Procedure, and trying to understand, interviewing the people who were the ones who were captured on film, torturing, people in Abu Ghraib, trying to get them to articulate their understandings of roles and responsibility is an incredibly difficult viewing experience, because it's easy to note how nobody ever accepts responsibility, and to analogize that to the larger problems of the war on terror. But I also think even in really pop culture films like Zero Dark 30, which, you know, was also considered very controversial because it does seem to legitimate torture in certain moments. But as we note, the end of the film, the very last scene, is the CIA operative who we've been pursues, the one who's been doggedly pursuing Osama bin Laden, right? She gets into a C-130 plane, doesn't know where she's going. The person asks her where she's going. She has no answer, and she cries. And people misinterpreted that in a gendered way to say, oh, you know, this poor woman, she doesn't have any loves in her life. She doesn't have any friends. She's lonely, right? But of course, if we actually analogize that and bring it outward and understand her as, you know, a kind of figure of America, we see the sense of not knowing where to go, a sense of loss without actually understanding if things were worth it, a sense of disappointment that the capture of bin Laden did not actually solve the problem of terrorism, a terrorism that our own actions then, you know, deepened in certain instances. So I think even in pop culture, we see a sense of criticism and failure and confusion that is often just bubbling right above the surface. And it's up to us to kind of grab hold of that and to talk about, you know, what that failure can help to lead us to make better decisions in the future.
That's very interesting. I never thought of the last scene of Zero Dark 30 in that light. I do have questions for Jill and Spencer specifically, but you guys can jump in on that response if you would like. Oh, I think you're muted, Jill. There we go.
I have two suggestions for pop culture that I think bring a little different perspective, though, although I'm not sure that they are as early as some of what Elisabeth mentioned. One is the documentary, The War Tapes, which is put together from footage on the helmets of, I believe, National Guardsmen and or reservists in Iraq. And it is a fabulous look at what that war is actually like for the individuals on the US side fighting it. A similar one, which is not a documentary, which takes place in Afghanistan, is Restrepo, which shows the absolute futility and fatuity of these young, well-meaning US officers meeting with these ancient Afghan community leaders and trying to tell them about all the great things that the United States has to bring them. The complete absence of communication and recognition of the other there is really powerful. And then the third one is The War Machine, which is a satire in which it's similar to 12 O'Clock High, in that we see that this problem happens again and again and again. The problem is the system, not the individual. We see Brad Pitt coming to Afghanistan as the latest general who has the plan to win the war. And his absolute inability to understand anything that's going on. And then he leaves broken, and the next general comes in with a plan to win the war.
Two offerings, I'll go real quick. The Battlestar Galactica TV show reboot is an amazingly subversive piece of filmmaking, TV making, I don't know what you call it, contemporaneous with the Iraq War. It is a very scathing critique of the war on terror, all the more scathing because they place our space Americans, for lack of a better term, in a condition of really true, severe, actual existential threat, and then build out very deep and probing explorations of what put them in that circumstance, and in particular, their actions, which are frankly genocidal, that contributed to this moment, but also show a depth of similar cast by the enemies of humanity that are also making their own very serious intellectual and moral mistakes guided by what they see as religious purpose. And then also, it's important when understanding the narratives of the war on terror to not center Americans and focus on the realities of the war that Americans have visited upon people. When Professor Hazelton talks about Afghans who aren't listening to all of the pitches that Americans in body armor are telling them they can bring, I've been on those missions. And what very often I did not understand, I did not get the sense that American officers in particular understood, is that the Afghans and like the Iraqis, I also saw this happen with, who they're talking to or trying to do is survive and evade the gaze of the United States and get these scary foreigners who don't speak their language, don't understand their customs, out of their house before they get killed. Because that's the reality of America overseas that Americans simply do not get exposed to in order to make sure that this perpetuates. This wasn't a circumstance of Afghans, as you endlessly hear from, all the way up to President Biden, who blames the Afghans for what the United States did to them, that somehow the foreign populations just weren't virtuous or wise or developed enough to accept the gifts that America was bequeathing them. So I would also recommend reading an excellent novel by Omar al-Akkad called American War.
Thank you for all three of you guys for those responses. I'm now going to turn to one more question, and then I'm going to get to the questions that are coming in the Q&A. So this question is kind of a dual question for Dr. Hazelton and Mr. Ackerman here. I'd like to know what you think it would mean to end the GY. I think both of your presentations strongly imply or state that should be the case. So what would it mean to end the global war on terrorism, either in terms of policies, politics, mentalities, the ethics of it? Either of you can jump in on that. Or also, Elisabeth, you can feel free on that.
Do you want me to go first, or do you want to go first, Professor?
Whatever you like.
I
can go if you're.
I've got it, but I don't want to. Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'll try and go quick. Abolition means total abolition. Break the tools of the war on terror. Repeal every single post 9/11 security authorization that there is. Ground the drone fleet. Prosecute those who have committed acts of extreme violence, not only against the people themselves, but against the Constitution. Accountability is at this point not just demanded, but demanded in severity, given how impunity has been an engine of the war on terror throughout. The same people that drove you into the war on terror are now going to drive you into a Cold War with China, and they're going to drive you in some cases into expanding the war on terror under cover of avenging January 6th, which I think we are in danger to speak to Elisabeth Anker's point of seeing as another melodrama requiring of melodramatic solutions. And that's a very dangerous thing, despite the depth of my eternal opposition to white supremacy, which we have to always remember is the oldest, most durable, and the most deadly terrorism in American history. Terrorism that feeds so deeply from all of Americans' founding myths. All of that has to go, every single aspect of it. The people who brought you and apologized for 9/11 should have to reckon, who brought the 9/11 era, should have to reckon with their responses, particularly if they want to enjoy the privileged positions in public life that they do. I think getting from here to there requires not elite politics, because elite politics will only perpetuate the war on terror. It requires grassroots action. It requires organizing. It requires forcing candidates for political office to make a binary choice and have to respect this binary choice between wielding political power and maintaining the war on terror. Everything that we currently do will only lead to the perpetuation of the war on terror, in large part because America is not a particularly democratic country in its resting state. It is at some of its least democratic in public forums, which is to say receptive to the people upon whose names action it will take in national security and foreign policy. All of this has to be abolished. All of this has to be put under severe challenge, particularly when we see through a pandemic and a manifested climate emergency that what we think of as national security is only the security of American imperial interest. It's not human security. Human security exists in solidarity. Human security cannot be national. Human security is international. Human security requires cooperation amongst peoples. Human security has to prioritize that over things like competing with the Chinese to dominate an increasingly uninhabitable planet. Thank you.
This is a great question, and that's a great answer. Being a political scientist, my answer is a little different. My answer is that it depends. It depends on whether you want to think of the end of the GWAT in terms of elite rhetoric, if you want to think of it in terms of public views, opinions, attitudes, assumptions, if you want to think of it in terms of military behavior, if you want to think of it in terms of state behavior, US behavior more broadly, abroad and at home. It depends on whether you want to identify the end as the dismantling of the vast national security infrastructure that has been built since 9/11. Or, for example, whether it means reeling in the expansion of executive powers that we've seen since 9/11. I think it's also possible to consider the end of the GWAT as having taken place on August 15th, 2021, when the Taliban strolled into Kabul. So I think whatever one defines as the end depends on what you're interested in understanding.
Elisabeth, you can feel free to jump in if you want.
Great. I mean, I agree with both of these answers. And I think, right, part of it depends on what we imagine the war on terror to be in the first place. Was it something that was really inaugurated all of a sudden when Bush, speaks on September 20th, 2001? Maybe if we understand that the 9/11 events started on, at 9 a.m. on September 11th. But of course, if we understand the larger prehistory of what led up to it, which I saw somebody was actually asking about in the questions, right? Like, how did American foreign policy contribute to what we now understand the war on terror to be? How did it contribute to the events on 9/11? Starting the narrative in that space also means that what we imagine the effects to be are also going to be different, right? If, and of course, part of the problem is, what is terror? Terror is a feeling, terror is an affect, terror is a tactic and a strategy. So to imagine what it means to end a war on terror, we all, to end fear, as George W. Bush said in his speech, that the war on terror was a war of freedom at war with fear, that means a war never ends, right? So part of it is even re-understanding, like, what do we mean by terror? Because it has been so nebulous, which is part of why we've seen such horrible kinds of mission creep. And the fact that it was never defined also means that there were never any boundaries around it. So maybe my answer is just to complicate that even more. But I would agree that it would have to be a dramatic restructuring of foreign policy, of domestic policy, of transnational forms of connection, and also translocal, not only transnational, right? And how do people, come together to live in the world that they want to be in?
Can I add one more thing? Just real quick. A war on terror ending is very hard to see while we continue to nurture senses of American exceptionalism. The war on terror in its operational form may end either by fatigue or by deliberate action in the case of Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan, though it's important to remember that he also explicitly says he retains the right to bomb Afghanistan at will. American exceptionalism will just find new monsters to destroy. We'll find, as with the case of China. So in that sense, ending the war on terror is both a beginning to get to the kind of world that might actually be a safer one for human beings, including Americans. But it doesn't end there. The task has to be, I think, finally, to confront American exceptionalism and break it and see its continuities with things within American history that I think we're increasingly more broadly understanding as disastrous. Before it was American exceptionalism, it was manifest destiny. Before it was manifest destiny, it was settler colonialism. These are genocidal ideologies. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to go to some of the audience questions here. And by the way, if you have additional questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the next 20 minutes or so. James Malarkey would like, and by the way, anyone on the panel can jump in on these. James Malarkey asked, to what extent did Israeli history and rhetoric serve as a moral and military model, justification, and guidance for the US war on terror?
I can go if anyone else wants to. No, I'm sorry. Go, Professor Hazelton.
I have a very brief answer in that I think it's more that the Israeli experience has been developed out of the US experience than vice versa. Although I think we can probably also see the causal arrow going in both directions.
To give a very specific example, the NYPD expressly taught itself the sort of policing that the Israelis perform to dominate the Palestinian people. This became a way for both Israel and specifically New York, which share a lot of important cultural bonds. And I say this as a New York Jew, for those to reassert themselves, but also for the Israelis to kind of tell Americans, and particularly for American politicians, to use Israel as a justification that these wars are the same thing, that the permanent domination, immiseration, expropriation, and ultimately extinguishment of Palestinian national identity is one theater in the global war on terror, and that criticizing Israel for its brutal, exploitative, and I will use the word apartheid behavior against the Palestinian people is a surrender by Americans to Osama bin Laden. It's propagandistic, it's foolish, but also it had real material consequences in a case like that of the NYPD, which comes to increasingly view throughout the 9/11 era, Muslim New York as areas of potential terrorism, not with any suspicion of a crime, but to permanently surveil and terrify these neighborhoods to the point where, in the neighborhood I was just describing, Little Pakistan, by 2003, by Pakistani estimates, 15,000 people had fled this neighborhood because of that sort of policing. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question from Michael Sokol for Elisabeth. Question is, even if we had somehow tamped the melodrama of the national emotions and national response to 9/11 in the early years of the war on terror, do you think it was inevitable that we'd end up with the kind of melodramatic presentation or melodramatic framing of this conflict?
Yeah, I don't think anything is inevitable. I mean, of course, people are going to have, watching kind of the horrors of watching planes fly into the towers, of understanding that you're actually watching people being murdered, which I feel like sometimes gets filtered out when we just see the anodyne images of like a plane flying and a tower falling. That is going to elicit, horror, grief, pain. But the question is, where do you place that grief and what do you do with it, right? When we look back at Bush's speech, and of course I want it to be clear, it's not that people are automatons that just follow George Bush, but I think he indicates a larger political scenario, right? But when he says grief has turned to anger and anger to resolution, he is giving us an emotional arc, describing it and then using it to legitimate the war on terror. He says, if you feel grief, which a lot of people did, right, then you feel anger. Okay, and then if you feel anger, then you are resolved. You are resolved to go to war in Afghanistan, right? And so that's a way. There's many other ways that grief could be used. What if grief and the experience of vulnerability, of transnational vulnerability, which was really rare for the US up until that point, what if that was used to find moments of solidarity with forms of transnational vulnerability that people feel all across the globe? What if that was a sense of national soul searching of, oh, this is what it means to be vulnerable to forms of political and state power that you feel that you don't have control over? And how can we create a world where we connect with other people based on this and try to not eradicate evil, but to try to bolster people's experiences of precarity in order for people to feel that they have more possibilities for collective flourishing, not only in the US, but across the world, right? That's a different way of making use of emotions politically. So I think that those are alternate options. And even though melodrama is certainly really popular in the US, it didn't need to narrativize 9/11 so strongly in the way that it is. That was a political choice, even as we might want to imagine that it was a moral one.
Thank you. John Mueller asks, the global war on terrorism's defenders say it saved thousands of lives in the United States, either through military action abroad or law enforcement activities at home, surveillance activities at home. How do you respond to this contention?
Alphonse, Gaston. Okay, I'll go. I have a quick answer.
Moderator,
John.
decide.
John, it's a fantastic question. And the answer is, we simply cannot know if the GWAT saved American lives on American soil or not. We simply have no way of understanding any causal relationship between what the United States did at home and what it did overseas. This was one of Bush's rhetorical tropes as well. Fight them there so we don't have to fight them here. But we simply cannot know. And to claim that we can is dishonest, I think, in plain terms.
I'm going to be a little spicier because I've spent 20 years working as a reporter and dealing with the institutions that made these claims. I was one of the reporters on the Edward Snowden story, so I got to see internal National Security Agency documents. And my answer to that is they lied to you. They lie to you routinely. They lie to you to preserve their budgets. They lie to you to preserve their authorities. When they tell you that the war on terror saved thousands and thousands of American lives, they're lying to you. If they had done that, inside those Snowden troves, we would have seen the documents that celebrate these amazing successes by this global panopticon that America reserved for itself the right to construct. Professor Hazelton is being extremely intellectually generous and charitable, and appropriately so. But the fact of the matter is, when people who benefit from telling you that they saved your life, and you have no idea about that, say that they saved your life, they're lying to you. They're telling you something that benefits them in the guise of benefiting you. I've dealt with these people. They lie routinely.
You know, one thing I would also add to that is part of, a cover story of the New York Times Magazine this weekend that also is based on a lot of the information from The Intercept about Terry Aubrey, who was actually, in the FBI for 20 years, after 9/11, working on trying to suss out whether there were homegrown terrorists in US Muslim communities. And what he discusses is basically all of the ways in which his job was terrorizing innocent people for over a decade, and the way in which he couldn't do it anymore, and then leaked documents and then went to jail for it. And so I think looking at it from his perspective, which is the internal view of somebody who was doing that work, and to see the ways in which he understood all of it as basically not doing the kind of work that we might imagine, and instead working to destroy the lives of many innocent people, especially people in immigrant and in Muslim immigrant communities and Arab communities, I think tells us a lot about what was and what was not accomplished.
Thank you. We have time for a couple more questions I'm going to take from the Q&A here. Matthew Clark is asking a question that I think I'd like to expand a little bit into a question about the Bush Doctrine more broadly. Matthew asks, would traditional deterrence and containment work against Islamist terrorists and rogue states armed with WMD? The broader question I'd like to ask on that is the global war on terrorism infrastructure that was created, the policies, the executive powers, was all that basically unnecessary to face this threat? I think the panelists seem to agree that there was a huge inflation of the threat and many unnecessary responses, but certainly there was at least Al-Qaeda as a demonstrated threat to the United States. So what, I'm just going to expand Matthew's question here. What was necessary for the United States to do post 9/11, and what policies, infrastructure, laws were excessive and unnecessary?
I have a quick answer to that. After 9/11, I think the United States did the first thing that it was important for it to do, and it was tragic for Afghanistan. There was no question that when you have the US military complaining that the state it's going to attack is a target poor environment, that it is going to be a tragedy for the people of that country. I think what the United States, in terms of serving its own interests, did need to do is what it was. It needed to punish the Taliban for hosting an actor that attacked US interests. And it was appropriate to punish Afghanistan in order to deter other states from letting their territory be used for attacks on US interests. Beyond that, internationally, I think continued emphasis on traditional spycraft rather than militarizing the CIA would have been smart. I think that the creation of the Director of National Intelligence, which Elisabeth did not mention, but which is that other behemoth, could have worked, but it was designed with so many fingers in the pie and so many conflicting interests at stake that it's I don't think we can even call it a successful pudding. It's kind of a mess, although the right idea is there. And then the great thing that the United States could have done and has done in only a lackadaisical manner over the past 20 years is focus on domestic resilience, protect nuclear sites, protect rail lines, protect chemical sites. I won't even say the ways in which my imagination plays around how very, very easy a mass terrorism attack could be with these sites unprotected. And yet, because of the tension between US security interests and US business interests, the government for 20 years and before has hesitated to actually order power plants, for example, to harden their security. And that is a tension within the US polity and the US government that I don't think in terms of realistic political choices we can get past, as much as I'd like to.
I don't think it's a tension. I think it reveals who runs the United States. It reveals that capital runs the United States. It reveals that your security is not as important as interests of capital, as the ability for those ultra wealthy to continue to act as they like. That is American history. That manifests in the war on terror in so many ways. The only victor of the war on terror is the defense industry. You ask what should have happened and what shouldn't. You have to bring the members of Al-Qaeda who are involved in this plot and their leadership to justice. Ideally, you would do that by indicting them, seizing them, and trying them. Whatever mechanism, therefore, to do that, because it obviously, they're obviously not going to surrender, then has to be considered militarily. But the trouble is that they want to draw you into precisely these sorts of conflicts because they've won these sorts of conflicts in prior instantiations before. So you can't do that. And that's exactly what the United States did. Absolutely every other aspect of the war on terror must be abolished. If the United States retains this apparatus, particularly of surveillance, then increasingly your freedom is a kind of academic concept. And just because you don't perceive the ways in which, in particular now, thanks to Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the expansion of what the Harvard Business School professor emerita Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism. Increasingly, these things are entirely symbiotic. The NSA sits through a program called PRISM on the major social media and tech companies, the platforms that we use as kind of the cost of doing business of the 21st century. And that's a really, really dangerous thing. It's a dangerous thing for the way in which your data is commodified and arbitraged in a way that you who generate this wealth, this now created wealth, cannot enjoy any of their fruits, but also in the way that it is entirely agnostic as to whether the NSA, whether an advertising company, or whether a hostile foreign actor sifts through it, analyzes it, seizes it, and ultimately weaponizes it. That's a really dangerous thing from the perspective of a robust definition of freedom. All of these authorities, all of these institutions and structures really do need to go. I want to give just one quick wonkish example because Professor Hazelton mentioned the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. A very subtle thing was accomplished by the creation of the ODNI. What is the ODNI? The ODNI is the new titular, if not always budgetary head of the constellation of intelligence agencies that the United States maintains. Before there was an ODNI, and the reason why there is an ODNI is that the director of the CIA dominated this entire enterprise and was also known as the Director of Central Intelligence, or DCI. That's the role that the ODNI replaces. One of the reasons, and this is in the 9/11 Commission, and it was relentless in the broader narrative why there needed to be an ODNI, that there is one, is because the CIA director was seen as having too much of a constituency within the CIA to adequately lead the other aspects of the intelligence community. There is certainly something to that because they come right from that community. But the subtle thing that happened by the replacement of the DCI position with the Office of the Director of National Intelligence is now the head of the intelligence community answers to no one but the President of the United States. Now they have no constituency except one that they can cultivate within the intelligence community. The relationship they really have to worry about is between the White House and Liberty Crossing. And you can see over the course of the very brief history of that position about how increasingly presidents rely on directors of national intelligence to get their way with the intelligence community. You saw that with Jim Clapper, who's a demonstrated liar. You saw that especially with Donald Trump kind of ripping the veneer off the enterprise and putting straight cronies, total clowns, like Rick Grinnell and John Ratcliffe into that position. Avril Haines, the current director of national intelligence, is not a clown. She's a rather intellectually serious person, but nevertheless, she depends for her job not on the intelligence agencies. She depends on her job by her relationship to President Biden. That is really a dangerous thing institutionally, that someone who enjoys such tremendous power within an enterprise that has such an implication for American freedom is responsive in reality, despite what it says in statute, to one person.
Well, thank you everyone for those responses. We are now over the allotted time, and so I want to make sure that our events today remain on schedule. Thank you all. Thank you to all three of you for some very interesting commentaries, for some spirited give and take here. I apologize to people who are still asking questions. There are a couple left in the Q&A. I apologize that we couldn't get to all of them. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending this. I'm going to do a quick virtual round of applause for our three panelists.
Can I
And
just say, Spencer and Elizabeth, you made fantastic arguments. Thank you so much. And Joseph, the synergy that you created with the three of us was also brilliant.
thank you very much.
Thank you. I learned a lot from everyone here.
So did I. This was a real pleasure. Thank you. I appreciate all of it.
Well, thank you very much for all three of you for your time and for your inputs here. We have another event coming up at 1:40, so just 5 minutes from now, on violent management, prevention, and recovery with a number of different presenters. And so I'm going to mute myself, and then those people will fire up in about 5 minutes. Thank you all.